The record that broke the Seventh Deliberative Council was not a battle report. It was a sound. Specifically, it was the sound of silence from Relay Station Omicron 9. A silence that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds before the station's automated distress beacon activated, broadcasting a single repeating phrase into the dark in 17 languages, including 3 that humanity had never been officially taught. We did not understand what we had done. That was the entirety of the message. 11 words, no coordinates, no names, no tactical data. Just that admission, cycling on repeat through the cold between stars until the Council's nearest receiver caught it 6 weeks later and a junior communications analyst named Verath Sol pressed play. She listened to it 3 times. Then she walked directly to the office of Arbiter Prime Thessaven and said 4 words that would later be cited as the last moment anyone in the galaxy genuinely underestimated the species called human. Sir, Earth went dark. Thessaven was not a being who startled easily. In 47 years of arbitration across 9 contested systems, he had watched civilizations collapse with the mild professional attention of a physician nodding a patient's deteriorating vitals. He understood, in the clinical way that all arbiters did, that civilizations rose and fell on the long tide of galactic time, and that the Council's role was not to prevent that tide, but to manage its damage. He read the full report. He set it down. Define dark, he said. Verath Sol had prepared for this question. No electromagnetic signature of any kind, no navigation beacons, no communication traffic, no thermal radiation consistent with industrial activity at previously recorded levels. She paused. No light from their primary orbital installations. The installations are still there. Our deep-range sensors confirm their physical presence. They simply are not powered. A catastrophic systems failure. That was our first interpretation, she said. But the timing, sir. Speak plainly, analyst. She set her own report on his desk. Earth went dark exactly 72 hours after receiving our colonial designation notification, to the minute. Thessaven looked at the report for a long time without touching it. Outside his office window, the slow rotation of the Council's orbital station turned the distant starfield past in a silent panorama of lights. Every one of those lights was a system. Every one of those systems had, at some point, received a colonial designation notification. None of them had gone dark. They had all responded the way civilizations responded, with negotiation or protest or reluctant compliance, with legal appeals filed through proper channels, with the ordinary dignified resistance of peoples who understood that the Council was larger than them and that there were, despite everything, worse alternatives. Get me the colonial administrator for the Sol system, Thessaven said, and get me the full archive of every communication we have ever exchanged with the humans, every single one. This was the first mistake. Not the order itself. The order was reasonable. The mistake was the assumption embedded in it, that the archive would explain what the humans had done. It would not explain anything. It would, instead, introduce a question that Thessaven would spend the next 4 years trying to answer, a question that would eventually reach the floor of the full deliberative council, trigger a constitutional crisis in 7-member systems, and ultimately force the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy to confront a possibility that nothing in their combined history had prepared them to consider. The question was simple. Had humanity done this on purpose? And beneath it, pressing upward like something massive moving under ice, the worst question, the one nobody in the council would say aloud for another 3 years. If they had, then what exactly were they planning to do next? The archive took 11 days to compile and cross-reference. In that time, 2 more relay stations near Sol reported anomalies. Not silence, the opposite of silence. A dense, almost impenetrable wall of signal noise broadcasting outward from Earth's approximate location on frequencies the Council's systems categorized, after significant processing effort, as deliberately incoherent. The humans were not simply dark, they were making darkness contagious. Varath Sul was the one who caught it, because Varath Sul had developed the habit of sleeping in her office chair in 3-hour rotations, refusing to leave the signals room until she understood what she was looking at. She was 26 years old by the human reckoning she'd taught herself during her posting to the Sol observation detail. She had read everything humanity had ever broadcast into space, their novels, their news programs, their philosophical debates, their inexplicable competitive cooking broadcasts, and she understood something about them that most of her colleagues did not. Humans were not subtle people. They were, in fact, almost constitutionally incapable of subtlety, which meant that when they were being subtle, it was deliberate. "They want us to see the noise," she said aloud, alone in the signals room at third cycle sleep shift. Nobody answered. That was fine. She was getting used to conversations where she provided both sides. "They want us to see the noise, but they don't want us to see what's underneath it." She pulled up the spectral analysis. She stared at it for 6 hours. Then she filed a report so far outside normal classification parameters that it took 3 separate arbiter signatures to formally receive it. When Thesivan finally read it, he sat motionless at his desk for so long that his assistant checked twice to ensure he was still breathing. The report said, "The noise is a shell. The actual signal beneath it is encoded using a cipher based on a human mathematical text published 40 years ago, titled," she had translated this carefully, "The Art of the Incomplete Message." The humans were not just hiding something. They had been hiding it since before the colonial designation, since before the Council had even voted on Sol Systems classification, since before, as best Varath Sul could calculate, the Council had formally acknowledged that humanity was a spacefaring civilization worth monitoring, which meant they had known what was coming. They had known, and they had prepared, and they had waited, and not one sensor array in the Council's entire monitoring infrastructure had noticed. The colonial administrator for Sol System was a being named Praetor Durathes, and he was, by any reasonable metric, not the right person for this moment. He was thorough, competent, deeply experienced, and possessed of the specific blindness common to people who have been thorough, competent, and deeply experienced for so long that they have forgotten what genuine surprise feels like. He received Thesaven's summons. He reviewed the situation reports. He scheduled a formal contact attempt with Earth's designated communication interface, and when that interface returned nothing but the signal noise, he escalated through standard colonial protocols. A second attempt, a third, a formal noncompliance notification, a preliminary sanction recommendation. He filed all of this carefully. He sent Thesaven a status report. It was complete and accurate and entirely useless. It was Varath Sul, reviewing the archive Thesaven had ordered, who found the thing that made everything worse. "Sir," she said, she had stopped waiting for appointments. Thesaven had stopped requiring them. "I found something in the oldest communications, the very first formal exchanges, when humanity was first making contact with the broader community." "What did you find?" "A question," she said. "The humans asked us a question 43 years ago, in what we filed as a routine diplomatic inquiry. We answered it and then marked the exchange as closed." Thesaven waited. They asked, "What is the exact legal mechanism by which the Council assigns colonial designations, not whether it could be challenged, not what the appeals process was." She looked at him steadily. They asked how the mechanism worked, the actual structural process. The silence in the room was specific and terrible. "We answered them," Thesaven said slowly. "Completely. Standard transparency protocol. We sent them the full procedural documentation." She set the relevant file on his desk. Every step, every dependency, every infrastructure requirement the Council uses to enforce designation status. 43 years. Thesivin turned the number over in his mind like a stone, examining what was underneath it. 43 years ago, humanity had been, by every recorded metric, a civilization barely capable of reaching their own moon with reliable consistency. They had no interstellar capability. They had no formal diplomatic standing. They had no reason that any council analyst had identified at the time to want that specific information. They weren't asking for themselves, Thesivin said. He heard the slowness in his own voice, the particular quality of a mind revising itself. Not for the civilization they were then. No, said Varathsal. They were asking for the civilization they planned to become. The first misinterpretation correction arrived in the form of a man. His name was Commander Yusuf Adami, and he was the captain of the Meridian Asterisk, one of 7 human vessels that materialized, not arrived, not decelerated into, materialized, appearing within the Council's sensor range with no approach trajectory. The monitoring arrays could backtrack. At the edge of Sol System's outer boundary, exactly 91 days after Earth went dark. The Council's assessment of the vessels was immediate and confident. They were civilian class, survey ships most likely. The hull configurations were consistent with human exploration vessels, and their power signatures were within the expected range for that class. The Council's tactical assessment rated them as non-threatening, flagged them for routine interception, and dispatched a diplomatic contact vessel to open negotiations. This was the second misinterpretation. The Meridian and her 6 companions were not survey vessels. The hull configurations were deliberate misdirection, a shell design. The Council would later understand that human engineers had been working on for 9 years. The power signatures had been calibrated to read within expected civilian parameters while concealing a completely different set of interior systems. But none of that was what actually mattered. What mattered was the message that Commander Adami transmitted the moment the Council's contact vessel came within communication range. It was not a negotiation opening. It was not a protest. It was not even a declaration. It was a question. I'm going to ask you something. Adami's voice came through the translation system, clear and unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a person who has rehearsed this moment so many times it has stopped feeling like rehearsal. And I want you to understand that the question itself is the answer to whatever you're planning to say next. The Council contact officer, a diplomatic specialist named Orvith, leaned forward. Proceed. What does the colonial designation actually give you? Adami said. If the colony decides it costs more to administer than it produces. Orvith opened his mouth, then he stopped. Because the answer, which he knew perfectly well, had been trained in, had administered across 4 other systems, was that a colonial designation without reliable resource extraction was an administrative fiction. It existed on paper. It held no economic or strategic value. The entire system of colonial enforcement was predicated on the assumption that the designated world would continue operating as it had been operating, would continue producing, would continue interfacing with Council trade and resource networks, because without that interface, the designation meant nothing. The Council couldn't administer a colony that had turned itself off. They had no protocol for it. In 400 years of colonial designation history, no world had ever simply stopped. I'll give you some time, Adami said, and there was something in his voice, not quite humor, not quite warmth, something adjacent to both, that the translation software flagged as culturally ambiguous, and that Orvith, who had spent his career reading diplomats, recognized immediately as the sound a man makes when he has already won and is waiting politely for the other person to realize it. We will need to consult with the Arbiter Prime, Orvith said. "Of course," said Adami, "we'll be here." He cut the connection. What the Council had understood in the weeks after Earth went dark was that humanity had shut down their visible infrastructure. What they had not understood could not have understood, because it violated every developmental model in the Council's sociological database, was how. A civilization did not simply turn itself off. The social disruption alone was theoretically catastrophic. The economic shock, the psychological impact of losing power, communications, industrial capacity. The Council's analysts had been quietly, separately, and then jointly running models on how long humanity could sustain the blackout before internal collapse forced them to re-engage with Council systems, and the most optimistic of those models gave them 4 months. The least optimistic gave them 6 weeks. They were now at 91 days. Not only had humanity not collapsed, the asterisk Meridian and her companions were evidence that they had been building, that the blackout had not been a shutdown at all. It had been a transition. This was the moment the Council's understanding cracked for the first time. Not broke, cracked. A hairline fracture in the certainty of 400 years. Verath Sul had been tracking the human cultural archive continuously, and it was there that she found the piece of information that changed the crack into something structural. Humanity had a concept they called asterisk rationing asterisk. They had another they called asterisk blackout protocols. They had centuries of documented experience with deliberate resource restriction under conditions of external pressure, wartime economies, siege conditions, voluntary austerity movements. And they had something none of the Council's other colonial populations had ever demonstrated at scale. They had done it willingly. Not because they were ordered to. Not because a government had forced compliance through enforcement mechanisms. The Council's intercepted internal human communications from the transition period, fragmentary, partially decoded, showed something the translation software initially flagged as an error, and then, after 3 independent verification passes, confirmed as accurate. Humans had asked each other asterisk. They had explained the situation. They had argued about it, loudly and publicly, and with the particular intensity that human arguments always had, and then the majority of them had agreed asterisk, and then they had done it. Across an entire planet. In 72 hours. "That's not possible," said Theshaven, when Verath Sul presented this finding. "No population of that size achieves coordinated voluntary compliance on a 72-hour timeline. The sociological barriers alone." "I know what our models say," she said, "but I've been reading their communications for 3 years, sir. I need to tell you something about humans that isn't in the formal assessments." "Go on." "They don't do what's rational when they're angry," she said. "Our models predict behavior based on rational self-interest, but when humans feel that something has been taken from them, something they believe was theirs by right, rational self-interest stops being the primary driver." She paused. "They become capable of absorbing an enormous amount of personal cost if they believe it will make a point." Theshaven was quiet for a moment. "What point are they making?" "That they would rather hurt themselves than accept a designation they didn't choose," she said, "and that they can survive hurting themselves longer than we assumed anything could." Here was what the Council did not know, could not know, and would not know for another 18 months. The human infrastructure was not gone, it had moved. Underground in some cases, literally. Geothermal power, aquifer-fed agricultural networks, tunnel systems that had been under construction for 11 years, which the Council's orbital sensors had interpreted, when they noticed them at all, as mining operations or civil engineering projects of no strategic significance. In the ocean, in other cases. The deep ocean, where the Council's monitoring had always been weakest, because the Council's monitoring methodology was based on models developed for their own civilizations, and their own civilizations had evolved on worlds where the ocean floor was a geological feature, not a place anyone would choose to live. Humanity had chosen to live there. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough engineers, enough agricultural specialists, enough power systems technicians to maintain a functional civilization underneath the visible surface that the Council's sensors were reading as dark. Commander Adami knew this. He had, in fact, spent 3 years living in one of the deep-water installations. He had watched his daughter learn to swim in corridors lit by bioluminescent panels, had eaten food grown under spectrum-adjusted lighting 4 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, had helped maintain the power relay systems that kept the installation running on a mix of thermal venting and ocean current generation that produced exactly enough power to sustain life, and exactly not enough to show up on Council monitoring as a meaningful signature. He thought about his daughter often during the waiting period. She was 9 years old. She had never seen the sun directly. She thought this was normal. He was not sure whether it broke his heart, or whether it was the reason he could stand in front of a Council diplomatic vessel and sound like a man who had already won. Probably both. Contact from the Council's Arbiter Prime, his communications officer reported, pulling him back into the present. Put it through. Thesivan's voice had a quality to it that the translation software did not flag, but that Adami, who had been reading Council communication transcripts for years, recognized as the sound of a man choosing his words with the specific care of someone who is no longer certain of the ground beneath him. Commander Adami, I would like to understand your intentions. I'd like to understand yours, Adami said. Specifically, and I want to be precise here, what exactly the Council planned to do with a colonial designation for a system that your own resource surveys rated as low yield. Because I've read those surveys. Your own analysts thought Earth was marginal. A pause. The designation was a standard classification procedure. Right, but you did it anyway. Why? Another pause, longer this time. Strategic positioning, Thesivan said, which was honest enough to be almost refreshing. The Sol system's location was the value, not its resources. A waypoint, a strategic node in a particular vector of Council expansion that would have used human space as a corridor without particularly caring what happened to the humans inside it. So we were real estate, Adami said. Not a civilization, real estate. That framing is reductive. No, Adami said, and something shifted in his voice, some quality of maintained patience finally reaching its boundary. That framing is accurate, and I want you to understand what you actually did, Arbiter Prime, when you sent us that notification. You made 72 hours happen. You made every single thing that happened after that possible. He paused. You woke us up. The silence from the Council vessel was absolute. We have been building, Adami said quietly, for 43 years, since the first diplomat you sent us was stupid enough to answer our questions honestly. We have been patient and careful, and we have watched how you operate, and we have built our own systems, and we have been waiting for you to give us a reason. He took one breath. You gave us a reason. The third misinterpretation, the one that would be argued over in Council analysis chambers for a generation, was the Council's interpretation of Adami's revelation. They heard it as a threat. It was not a threat. This was something Varath Sul understood immediately and spent 18 months trying to convince her superiors to understand. He's not threatening to destroy anything, she said, in the first of what would become a long sequence of increasingly urgent briefings. He's not claiming military superiority. Look at the fleet he brought, 7 ships. 7. Against the Council's nearest response fleet, which could field 300. He knows the numbers. He's not suicidal and he's not stupid. Then what is he doing? Thesivan asked. He's making a demonstration, she said. He's showing you what the blackout actually was. Not a protest, not a breakdown, a proof of concept. She leaned forward. He's showing you that they can do it, that they built it, that it works. And he's asking you politely for now to reconsider whether a civilization that can survive 91 days of total voluntary blackout and emerge with functioning warships is the kind of civilization you want to designate as a colony. Thasavin considered this, and if we don't reconsider. Varath Sul was quiet for a moment. Then I think he showed you 7 ships specifically because he wants you to ask that question, because the answer to that question is the thing he actually wants you to sit with. 7 ships were visible. How many were not? The answer to that question took the Council's intelligence apparatus 14 months to partially reconstruct, and the reconstruction was incomplete, and would always be incomplete, and this was, Varath Sul eventually understood, also intentional. The humans had not built a fleet. They had built the asterisk infrastructure to build a fleet, distributed across the deep ocean installations, the underground networks, the 17 orbital platforms that the Council had never thought to re-examine because their power signatures remained consistent with the civilian survey stations the Council had always believed them to be. The platforms were not survey stations, had not been for 9 years. They were manufacturing nodes, each one producing components small enough to individually avoid triggering detection thresholds, collectively assembling something that the Council's best strategic analysts, reviewing the data in retrospect, estimated could potentially have fielded 80 to 120 combat-capable vessels within 6 months of the blackout ending. Could asterisk potentially have asterisk, past tense? Because, and this was the thing that made the Council's third misinterpretation so catastrophic, the humans had not built the fleet in order to use it. They had built it in order to not use it. The fleet was a ceiling, a demonstration of capacity, not intent, a way of saying, we could have escalated this and we chose not to, and we want you to understand both halves of that sentence. They are trying to negotiate, Varath Sul said, for the 5th time in her 5th briefing, her voice holding onto patience the way a climber holds a rope. They are not trying to fight. Fighting doesn't benefit them, their system is still dark, their population is still underground and underwater, they are sustaining real cost right now. Every day of the blackout is a day someone's child is growing up without sunlight. They want this to end, but they want to end it as equals, not as a colony. What they want, said Councillor Methashira, who represented the expansion portfolio and who had been the primary architect of Saul's colonial designation, is irrelevant to what they are entitled to under Council law. With respect, Varath Sul said, the commander made a fairly compelling point about what Council law actually requires for a colonial designation to be meaningful. Council law does not require the colony's cooperation, Methashira said. No, said Varath Sul, it requires the colony's productive output, which requires their infrastructure, which they have moved. She paused. Where exactly do you propose we administer from, Counselor? What do you propose to extract from a planet that has buried everything worth extracting? The room was quiet. They could not maintain this indefinitely, Methashira said. They have maintained it for 14 months, Varath Sul said. Their model said 6 weeks. This landed the way she intended it to. She watched it move across the room, this specific implication, that the Council's models had been wrong about humanity before, had been wrong specifically in the direction of underestimation, and that their current confidence in the 6-week timeline was based on the same models that had already failed them twice. What she did not say, because she did not know it yet, was that the humans had not been running on the 6-week model. They had been running on a 43-year model. And they had built into that model a margin they called, in the internal document she would not access for another 4 months, the tolerance window, the amount of additional time they believed they could sustain the blackout beyond any external estimate of their capacity. The tolerance window was calculated not on industrial capacity or food production or power generation. It was calculated on something the Council's sociological models had no category for. It was calculated on how angry people were willing to stay. Commander Adami's daughter was 10 when the second round of formal negotiations opened. He had not told her they were happening. He had told her he was going to work, in the way parents tell children things that are technically true and deeply incomplete. She had accepted this with the particular trust of children who have grown up in contained environments, for whom the world is exactly as large as the space they've been allowed to occupy, and who have learned to read safety not from physical surroundings, but from the steadiness of the adults around them. Her name was Amara. She could name every bioluminescent species in the installation's observation corridor by genus. She had strong opinions about the nutritional profiles of algae-based protein systems. She thought that the color of artificial sky, a particular shade of blue the installation's lighting engineers had spent 6 months calibrating, was the most beautiful color in the world, because it was the only sky she had ever known. Adami thought about her during the negotiations. This was tactical. Partly, thinking about her kept him from responding to Methashira's pointed provocations in ways that would have felt satisfying and been counterproductive. But it was also something simpler and harder to name. He was doing this for her, and he was also doing it to asterisk her, in a way he couldn't undo, because no matter what the negotiations produced, she had already grown up without son, and that was already a cost that had already been paid. And the person who had paid it was 10 years old and currently, probably, arguing with the installation's head nutritionist about the specific texture of the algae protein loaf. "We are prepared," said Arbiter Prime Thessaven, "to discuss modified engagement frameworks." "That's not what we're discussing," Adami said. "Commander, modified engagement frameworks are how you recolonize us with different paperwork. We both know that." Adami kept his voice level, not hostile, matter of fact. "What we're discussing is recognition of Earth as a sovereign peer system under full council membership, not a colony, not an associate territory, a member." Thessaven's hesitation was brief but visible. Full membership requires a review process that typically takes 70 years, I know. I've read your procedural documentation. A pause. Adami let the silence sit for a moment, let the implication of that sentence, 43 years. They had been reading the documentation for 43 years, settle into the room before he continued. "We're not going to wait 70 years, so the question isn't whether we qualify under the standard timeline. The question is whether you want a functional relationship with the Sol system civilization in the next 18 months, or whether you want to go to your member states and explain why a single system population managed to sustain a complete economic blackout for longer than your modeling said was possible, and why your enforcement mechanisms produced no effect whatsoever." The counselors who were present, Verath Sol had been allowed into the room as a technical advisor, a concession that Methashira had objected to and Thessaven had overridden, were very still. "Because that's the conversation," Adami said. "The story of what happened here is going to spread regardless of what we decide in this room, and the story either says, the humans went dark and the council adapted and now everyone has a better arrangement, or the story says, the humans went dark, the council couldn't do anything about it, and the standoff ended because the humans eventually got what they wanted." He folded his hands. Both stories end the same way. The difference is how the council looks in each version. Methashira leaned forward. "You're asking us to capitulate to extortion." "I'm asking you," Adami said, with a patience so deliberate it was itself a kind of force, "to recognize that designation without consent is colonization, that colonization without benefit to the colonized is exploitation, and that we looked at what you were offering, looked at what it would cost us, and decided we would rather pay the cost than accept the offer." He met Methashira's eyes across the table. "That's not extortion. That's a negotiating position from people who have already decided how much they're willing to lose." The counselor opened his mouth. He closed it. Verath Sol, watching from the corner, felt the room change. Not dramatically, No one made a speech. No one conceded anything aloud. But she had been in enough negotiations to recognize the moment when the people on the other side of the table stopped calculating whether they could win and started calculating what losing cost. It was a small moment. It looked like nothing. It was everything. The formal recognition process took 16 months. It was contentious, repeatedly stalled, challenged by 3 member systems, and survived 2 separate votes of no confidence in the modified procedure. In the history books, it would eventually be described as an administrative negotiation, which was technically accurate and almost entirely missed the point. During those 16 months, the installation stayed dark. Not because Adami required it, not because the negotiating strategy demanded it, because the humans who had moved underground and underwater and into the carefully calibrated artificial skis had been asked again, asked, not ordered, whether they wanted to come back up while the negotiations were ongoing. And the answer had been, across population surveys that the council later obtained and pored over with something between disbelief and awe, a consistent 67% asterisk no. Not because they couldn't, because they wanted the point made completely. Because a species that will spend 16 months underwater to prove a point is a species that has decided, at some collective level that bypasses the individual calculations of any single person, that the principle matters more than the cost, that some things are worth more than comfort, that there is a kind of stubborn, specific, almost irrational dignity that they will maintain at enormous personal price. Not because anyone required them to, but because they looked at the alternative and found it insufficient. Amara Adami was 11 years old when the recognition vote passed. She saw actual sunlight for the first time on a Wednesday. Her father had told her it would feel warm on her skin, and it did, and she stood in it for a long time with her eyes half closed, not speaking. He waited. "It's different from the installation lights," she said finally. "Yes," he said. She thought about this, better or different. He started to say better asterisk. He stopped, looked at his daughter, this child who had learned the genus names of deep ocean bioluminescent species before she learned to read a surface map, who thought algae protein loaf was comfort food, who had grown up in an artificial sky that a team of engineers had built with enormous care to approximate the real one. "Different," he said. She nodded like that settled something. The council record of the Sol system reclassification hearing was sealed for 40 years. When it was eventually released, the most cited passage was not the formal vote tally, not the recognition statement, not any of the political documents that historians initially expected. It was a memo, internal, written by Verath Sol the morning after the final vote, when she was still Theshaven's analyst and not yet the interspecies assessment director she would become. A position the council created specifically because of what happened with Earth, specifically because they had not had anyone filling that role before, and had paid for the absence in ways they were still calculating. The memo was addressed to the Arbiter Prime. It was 6 paragraphs long. The final paragraph read, "I want to be precise about what I believe we observed over the last 32 months. It was not strategy, though there was strategy in it. It was not military capability, though the capability exists and should be respected. What we observed was a civilization that looked at an imposition and decided, collectively, and without being compelled to do so, that they would rather spend 2.5 years teaching their children to live without sunlight than accept it. This is not a thing I know how to model. The reason I do not know how to model it is that every model we use is built on the assumption that any given civilization will optimize, at some threshold point, for reducing its own suffering. I no longer believe that assumption applies universally. I believe there are civilizations, I now believe humanity is one of them, for whom the optimization function includes a variable we have no symbol for, which might be most accurately translated, though imperfectly, as the cost we will pay to be the authors of our own story. I do not know how to advise the Council about a civilization for which that variable is effectively uncapped. I do not know whether to recommend we treat this as a threat or an inspiration. I only know that they won, and they won specifically because they were willing to pay what we were certain no one would pay, and that the gap between our certainty and their willingness is the most important thing I have ever failed to predict. Theshaven had filed the memo in the standard administrative archive and never responded to it directly. But 16 months later, when the recognition vote passed and Commander Adami shook his hand across the formal boundary of the negotiating table, the first time they had been in the same physical space, Theshaven had said, quietly enough that only Adami could hear it, "How long would you have continued?" Adami had looked at him for a moment, not calculating the question, just deciding whether to answer it honestly. "Until there was nothing left to continue with," he said, "and then we'd have figured out what came after that." Theshaven had held this answer for a long time. He thought about it during the long procedural aftermath, during the endless administrative requirements of the reclassification, during the quiet periods in his office when the starfield rotated past outside his window, and he thought about how many of those lights were systems, and how many of those systems had received colonial designation notifications, and how many of them had ever, once, asked the question the humans had asked 43 years ago with the calm patience of people already planning for a future they did not expect to live to see personally. None of them had. None of them had ever thought to ask how the mechanism worked, because none of them had looked at the Council and seen not an authority to defer to but a system to understand, a problem to solve, a thing that could, with enough time and patience and collective willingness to endure, be changed. The other civilizations had wanted to survive the Council. Humanity had wanted to outlast it. And the difference between those two wants, the distance between them, the specific and terrifying width of that gap, was the thing that kept Theshaven awake in the particular way that people are kept awake not by fear, but by a thought they cannot stop returning to, a question that won't close. Not what will humans do next, but how long have they already been planning it? Outside his window the stars turned, every one of them a light, every one of them now a question. And somewhere in the dark between them, in the cold, precise silence that Relay Station Omicron 9's distress beacon still cycled through, we did not understand what we had done over and over, a confession that had never been recalled because no one had thought to issue the recall order. Humanity's 7 ships held their position at the edge of Sol System's boundary, not threatening, not withdrawing, simply present asterisk, the way something is present when it has decided it will not be moved, and is content to let you take exactly